Hello, and welcome everyone. My name is Alba Rivas. I am a developer advocate here at Salesforce, and today I'm going to talk you and also to do a bit of code regarding the topic of data security in Apex. So we are going to do a first quick review of what's data security. Then we will see the different means in which you can enforce data security in Apex. And then, well, for that, I'm going to use an app that I have created already. But what we are going to do is to do some live coding. We're going to extend that app, including some examples of how to enforce data security using the new database operations in user mode beta that it is available in your orgs and that you can try out as of today. Amazing. So hello everyone in the chat. I'm seeing Julian Duque. I'm seeing a name that I don't know how to pronounce. I'm sorry. And I'm seeing also Harshit Saxena. Hello, and thank you for being there. If you have any questions or comments during the chat, make sure to add them into the chat window during the session because I will be monitoring it. Okay? So first of all, something that you all love. This is the forward-looking statement slide, which just means that Salesforce is a publicly traded company and you should make purchasing decisions based on the functionality that is currently available. And with that, let me show my screen. Let me say hello to some more people in the chat. There we have Agustin, Pedro Manuel, Abhishek, Rohit, Amir, Chitan. I don't know how to pronounce your name again. Sorry, it's a different alphabet than the one that I use. We have also Gabriel Paez and Rohit. Okay, amazing. So thank you very much, all of you, for connecting. So first of all, I want to do a quick review. I promise it's going to be quick because this is a codeLive and I want to spend most of the session coding. But I think it's important to do a quick review of the basics so that the people that don't have these ideas very clear in their minds yet can start from a better point watching the video, okay? So data security in Apex is basically object level security, field level security, and record level security are the three layers that you can configure declaratively, right, in your organization with profiles, permission sets, with the organization-wide defaults, with the sharing rule, etc., etc. So these three different layers cover the security for objects in general, the object level security, which is also known as CRUD for create, read, update, delete, refers to doing those operations over an object. Then we have FLS, which is field level security, which is related to operations over specific fields of an object. And then we have sharing, which is related to records, right? So what happens is that you configure, your administrators configure all that declaratively in your organization. And in most of the places in Salesforce is going to enforce that security, those three security layers automatically. But it happens that in Apex, you have to do it yourself. So that's what we are going to see today. So in which places does Salesforce enforce data security by default? Well, most of them, okay? If you are doing create or update, read, delete operations through the standard UIs or through any of the APIs or through execute anonymous or through a Visualforce standard controller, even through Lightning Web Components when you use Lightning form components or the Lightning Data Service. I'm missing this feature here, okay? In all those cases, the three layers of security, of layer security, data security are enforced by default. However, in Apex classes, Apex triggers, and Apex web services, basically any Apex code that you write, that is not going to happen. We say that Apex runs in system mode, which means that Salesforce is not enforcing that security for you. And the other mode is called user mode, the mode in which Salesforce enforces security. Okay, I see some more people in the chat. Hello, Brolin, hello, Mani, Barati, and hello, Amir. Okay, nice to have you there. So, I told you that in system mode, this is in Apex, basically, you need to enforce object, record, and field level security yourself in your code, okay? You as a developer need to do that. So there are different means to do that, and we are going to review them briefly, okay? So let's start talking first only about object level and field level security, okay? To enforce object and field level security, we have several mechanisms. The first mechanism that was released like at the beginning of Apex, okay, is using schema methods. Schema methods are used to verify if an object is accessible, is creatable, is updatable, or is deletable, okay? If you go to the help, you will find a section called Enforcing Object and Field Permissions, and they explain to you this way, the most basic way of enforcing object and field level security, which is using these schema methods, okay? So to see this code in action, what I did was to create an app. It's an app that we are going to use along the talk to demonstrate all what I'm saying, okay? So this is an app in which I have created several Lightning Web components. Those Lightning Web components are calling an Apex method, and I'm doing different things in those Apex methods. For instance, in this component here, I'm not checking for security at all. And in this component here, I'm doing some CRUD checks. Remember, CRUD object level security with the schema methods, okay? In this browser, I'm seeing all the components rendering exactly the same data because I'm logged with the system administrator, okay? But if I go to a different desktop, in this desktop, I have logged in with a different user, a user that has a low permissions profile, and is different what the user sees depending on the checks that we are doing in the code. Okay, indeed, let me refresh this because I think it's outdated. Perfect, okay? So, as you can see here, when I'm not doing checks in the code, I'm going to show you the code in just a second. The records are returned by the Apex method, and I'm able to see all the information of them, even if this user doesn't have access. However, if I'm doing some checks with the schema methods, we can see that the objects are not being returned. So why I'm saying that the user doesn't have access? Because the user that I'm seeing in the other desktop has this permission set assigned. It's a permission set in which I have disabled all the read, create, edit, and delete abilities for the account object. So it's normal that if I'm not doing any checks, okay, Apex code runs in system mode and I'm able to see all the records, which may be a security breach. However, if I'm doing some checks, and we are going to see the different ways in which we can do those checks, as this security here is enforced, it means that I'm not going to be able to see those records, which is a correct behavior because we don't want to expose that sensitive data, that data that an admin has determined shouldn't be exposed to this user. So what's the code? The code, I have written all the Apex methods that I'm calling from the different Lightning Web components here in this class, account controller, and we're going to see each of them independently. So first of all, this is the method that is being called when we render the first Lightning Web component, the one that has no checks. Again, as here I'm not doing any checks, any security checks, and the code runs in system mode. What is happening is that I'm returning all the records to the front end, to the Lightning Web component, and the user, even though he has said he shouldn't have access or object access or field level security access to that record, he or she is seeing those records, okay? Security breach. Then, how do I use those schema methods? Okay, so if I want to check for the object level security, then what the documentation tells me is that I have to use schema.sObjectType. The name of the SObject for which I'm checking the security, and then there are 4 different methods. Is accessible, which is the one that I need to use before reading records. Is creatable, which is the one that I need to use before inserting records. Is updatable, which is the one that I need to use when updating records. And is deletable, which is the one that I need to use before deleting records. But here I'm only showing SOQL for now. Okay, so this was, as I told you, it's something accepted, it's a way to do it, but we are going to see that nowadays we have much more modern methods to do that. Okay, I'm seeing a comment from Santanu Roy. He says that, hi Alba, very important session and I always attend. Thank you so much for attending and I hope that you learn something new every time that you attend a security session. And also Amir Khan said, organization-wide defaults sharing security. Yes, that's what you use to control the lowest level of security for record sharing. Amazing. So there is a question from Augustin Mihail, and he's asking something that is, I think, the most common mistake that Salesforce developers make when trying to enforce security in their code. He's asking if these methods are influenced by the with and without sharing. And the answer is no, okay? These methods only check for object level security and field level security, and checking for record level security, it's something that is done in a different way. It's done with sharing keyword or without sharing keyword. That's with the old methods. We are going to see that with the new new beta that is available to check for security, the 3 things, object, record, and level security, can be checked in the same way. But if you use older methods, then bear in mind that record security is enforced with sharing, and then object level security, you have to do it in a different way. Something important to know is that Salesforce, the order in which they perform the checks is, first, it checks for object level security, second, for record level security, and third, for field level security, okay? So it may happen that your field level security check doesn't fire because first Salesforce has checked for the record security one. But in terms of how do you enforce object, field, and record level security, object and field level security have their mechanisms, and then sharing is only for record level security, okay? But let me continue with the examples because you are going to understand this really well. Okay, so we are doing some cross checks. The permission set doesn't allow me to see those records, and the schema checks worked well. Something that we can also check is permission at field level security, at field level, right? That check is a bit more granular because an object to be able, a user to be able to see a field needs to first be able to or have permissions to see the object, and then have also permissions to see that field. So the field is a more granular check and security configuration. We can do that also using the schema methods. The only difference is that instead of saying, is this object accessible, we use exactly the same methods, but over the fields. So here, for instance, we are saying, is the account name field accessible? Is the account annual revenue field accessible? Etc. Okay? If you perform these kind of checks, the object level security check is implicit. This is if you have a configuration in which, for instance, in your permission set, you have read permission. You don't have read permission, but you have permission to see the account name, then with this check, the result of this method, of this check, is going to be false because we don't have, or the user doesn't have access to see the account, even though he has access to see the name, okay? So it's first the object and second the field. So that's like the oldest way in which we used to check schema methods. But we have some new approaches which are easier to use. So let me back to this slide because I think it's very easy to see the different methods. So for queries, we have something called with security enforced. You may have seen this in the code, in the sample apps code that my team creates, for instance, or in other kind of code. And with security enforced is a keyword that you can use in your SOQL queries to enforce object and field level security. Again, nothing to do with sharing, okay? Only object and field level security. As you can see here in my examples, in this Lightning Web component, I'm using with security enforced, and the result is slightly different because the behavior of with security enforced is that an exception happens, okay, saying insufficient permissions, the query include an inaccessible field, but at the end, the protection is there, right? Is there because I'm not able to see the records, and you can handle that exception and do whatever you want with it. You can present a more fancy error to the user, right? Than this error that I'm showing here, which is just the exception. The way in which you use with security enforced is this one. You just include it in the query, and is as simple as this. So much better, right? If you think it's not better, tell me in the chat window and we can have a discussion. But I think as a developer, it's much easier to use this than to have to check for every single field if it's accessible, okay? This is something that you can use in your queries. Very, very useful. Then there is something else that can help you enforce object and field level security, which is a method called security.strip_inaccessible. With this method, what we do is to retrieve from the database only the objects and the fields for which the user has access to, okay? So here we have an example. In this component here, we're using the strip inaccessible, and what happens is that as my permission set doesn't give me read access on the object, is simply telling me that you don't have access to the entity. This is the code for that, okay? What we are doing is to perform a query. We are stripping the inaccessible fields, taking into account that I want to filter that by the access type readable, and then that method returns an object called security decision, and from that security decision object we can obtain the records. Okay, so what happens, so here I don't have access to entity, but what happens if I edit this permission set and now I'm going to give read access for the object? So object level security is okay, that check is going to pass. But then I'm showing in the table the account name for which I have read access, but I'm also showing the annual revenue for which I don't have access and the industry for which I don't have access. We're going to change the permission set and we're going to see the effect. Let me refresh the page. And now we can see what the strip inaccessible method does. So here, as I have access, or I have read access at object level, I'm able to see the object, right? The records returned, but the strip inaccessible method is removing from that result the fields for which I don't have access. Something that changed here also is that now our Lightning Web component, in which we were just doing CRUD checks, the object checks, is returning, is showing the records, because here we were not checking for the fields. However, in this component, or this component here, we still don't see anything, because here we were doing the FLS checks with the schema methods, and here we were using with security enforced with checks for field level security too. There is a question from Santanu Roy. He says, if I already configured my profile or permission set with all read write, then why I need to check security enforce or schema method checks in my code? Yes, Antanu, this is because of this. Because all the things that you configure in your permission set and profiles are going to be enforced when you do things in user mode. This is when you are using the standard UI, the APIs, etc., etc. But in Apex, by default, those checks are ignored, are not enforced, and you have to do it yourself. The reason it was designed that way is because there are some times in which Apex code just needs to run in system mode, because the Apex code is doing like is implementing some business logic that needs to run behind the scenes and have access to all the fields of a table, for instance, right? But it's important to perform these checks when we are presenting that information to the user, okay? That's the key. If you are going to show that information to the user, then it's important that you enforce those checks yourself. And most of the times you will be doing that, okay? Perfect. So let's continue talking about this, and we're going to code live our first thing today, okay? So I told you about these three methods of enforcing object and field level security, but there is something new called, it's a beta, and it is called Secure Apex Code with User Mode Database Operations. And in this case, the keywords that we are going to use that belong to this beta will also enforce sharing, okay? That's the difference with the other things that we have seen here, the other methods. These methods only enforce object and field level security, and you have to enforce sharing with other means that we're going to talk about in a second. But if you use the keywords and the method explained in this beta that is available in your orgs. It's a beta program, but it's already there. You can use it. So if you use this method, then it's going to apply to object, field, and record level security, making things much more easy. So let me show you the page for that beta. I always say pilot because it was pilot before, but now in summer it's made it to beta. So they tell you that this is something that you can use in static and dynamic SOQL and DML, okay? And we're going to, as we were writing an example for SOQL, we are going to take a look at how to enforce data security with this pilot, this beta again, in a SOQL query. And what happens is that a new keyword is going to be available. The keyword is with user mode. The difference with the with security enforced keyword is that this keyword also enforces sharing. Okay, and I don't know if behind the scenes it's more performant or something. That is something that the product manager could probably clarify, but at the time of developing code, this is what you have to bear in mind. So we're going to create a new method here in which we are going to enforce object, field, and record level security for a query using this beta feature. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to copy this code, this method, which is very similar. I'm going to call it get accounts with user mode, which is the new keyword that we can use. And here, instead of saying with security enforced, we are going to say with user mode. As simple as that, okay? Then what I'm going to do is to create a Lightning Web component, and we're going to include it in the page. I'm going to copy one of the components that I already have for simplicity. For instance, I'm going to copy the read with security enforced, and I'm going to call it we read with user mode. I'm going to change the name of the files. So let's change the HTML a little bit. Now the title is going to be SOQL with user mode. In the JavaScript file, I'm going to import the new method that I have created, which is get accounts with user mode. This method is being called here with the wire service, and that should do the trick. I'm going to deploy this component to my org, like this, and then, okay. I forgot to deploy the controller, of course. I need to deploy the controller first. And now I'm going to deploy the Lightning Web component. Okay, something that I like to do is to change the pages with code. I prefer to do it with code. You can call me crazy, but I like to do that. So I'm going to add the component into the Flexi page directly in the code. So is this Flexi page, read examples. And what I'm going to do is to add another item instance here. And the component is called read with user mode. Right, so let's deploy the page to our organization too. Normally I use Scratch orgs, but this is an org that I have been reusing for several talks. So that's the reason that I'm using a developer or instead. So now I'm going to refresh the page to see if our component is there. And fantastic, it's telling me no such column, annual revenue on entity account. So it's checking for the field level security and it's not finding the annual revenue column because the user doesn't have access for that field, because we don't have access in the permission set of the user. Okay, so this is going to be the new method that you can use, and that is more effective because it checks for everything: object, field, and record level security. There is a question. Okay, Agustin, yes, I'll make sure to zoom in a little bit in the browser next time. Let me do it. Hope that now you can see it better. And Ratindra has a question. So now we can skip with sharing keyword while declaring the class if we decide to use with user mode in every SOQL we use inside the class. Okay, that's a really good question. So technically you could do it, because if you are using this user mode check both in all your queries and all your DML operations, later on we are going to see how to use it in your DML operations, you would be protected against record level security vulnerabilities, right? Or against leaking record level security or not enforcing record level security, better said. But I think that anyway, it is a best practice to use with sharing. So I think that I would prefer, so if I was developing an app, I would prefer to have with sharing there, just in case the data that you are consuming from another class or something similar has not been secured correctly. So I think I would keep the with sharing, but technically, according to the behavior of these checks, you could remove it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the product manager a recommendation about this question, and I will add a comment into the video once we finished. Okay? Amazing. So that's what I wanted to share about SOQL. Then we have DML, right? With DML, we have exactly the same methods, except the with security enforce and the with user mode, because those are keywords that you use in the SOQL queries, right? But you're doing schema CRUD checks, doing schema FLS checks, and using the strip inaccessible checks method is something that you can use. I'm going to show you the code for the different methods in which we are doing add. So here I have my account controller again. And if I scroll down a little bit, I have the methods that I'm calling from those Lightning Web Components in the DML tab, in which we are demonstrating the different ways in which you can enforce object and field level security in DML operations. So this is the first one, in which we don't perform any record level security. So if the user doesn't have access to create a record, for instance here, okay, I don't have access to create an account, and my code, my Apex code is not doing any check, I'm going to be able to create an account, okay? However, if I implement some checks, I can implement a check using the schema method, this time using the is creatable or is updatable or is deletable method. Or if I do kind of the same checks but for fields, right? Then those components are not going to work, because the first one is going to tell me that I don't have object permission to create accounts, and the second one is going to tell me that I don't have field permissions to create the account. That is like the oldest way of checking for CRUD permissions. And for DML permissions, for object and field level security permissions in DML operations. The strip inaccessible method is something that we can use also in DML operations. So for instance, here I'm creating an account and I'm setting the annual revenue and the industry. And if the user doesn't have access to create or edit some of these fields, for instance, let's say that the user doesn't have access, as we saw here, to create or edit the annual revenue field, then I can use the security.strip inaccessible method to remove those fields for which the user doesn't have create access from the object, and then do an insert, but only specifying the fields for which the user has create access. So this is a way of gracefully downgrading the insert operation that, instead of throwing an error, is just going to populate the fields for which the user has permission. So if here I click this strip inaccessible method, I need to give permission to create accounts, of course. Let's change this. So I have create permission for the object, but then for the fields, I only have edit access for the name, not for the annual revenue or the industry. So here we're going to click on create account again, and then the account was created, but let's take a look at how the account looks like. Probably better the old views. And is this one, the last account that we created. So we can see that the name of the account is specified, but then things, well, I'm not able to see the annual revenue here, obviously, because I don't have access. So let me go back to the system administrator, and we are going to see the account that we created. So I think it's this one. No, let me take a look at the code because I'm not sure. So it should be Acme. Okay, so it's this one. We can see that we have been able to create the record, but as we use the stripped inaccessible method, we didn't populate the annual revenue or the industry. This is to prevent errors. Okay? And before implementing an example for the user mode database operation pilot for DML operations, I'm going to read some more comments that we have in the chat. So we have a question saying, is there some limitation to with security enforce if it is used in a controller class of the site? Site has its own profile. I added read permissions for the lead object in it. So I'm not aware of any limitation. You should be able to use it in your Apex code, but my recommendation is that you try it out just in case, because I don't know like every single limitation of the platform. So try it out. If you have problems, you can always write into the Salesforce Developers group in the Trailblazer community, and we can help you or propose a workaround. Okay, so you're saying if you try to use with security enforce, you're getting a query exception. Exactly, you are getting a query exception because with security enforce throws a query exception, okay? Query exception. Okay, throws a query exception if the user that is running the query or that is firing the Apex code that runs the query doesn't have object or field level security permissions. So what's happening in your case is that your user doesn't have object or field level security permissions for the things that you are trying to retrieve in that query. Okay, so it makes sense that you are receiving a query exception. Exactly, so Kamal is giving the same recommendation to make sure that the user has the correct permission, but you are using it correctly, okay, as far as I understood your problems. Amazing. So now what we are going to do, we are going to create another component here in which we are going to do the same checks, but with the pilot recommendation, with the beta, again, with the pilot. I have my pilot in the mind, sorry. So this is the pilot documentation. So the pilot says, again, the beta says that what you have to do is every time that you are going to perform a DML operation, for instance, insert or update or delete, you can use this new keyword. You can do insert as user, which means in user mode, and then the object or the list of objects that you want to insert. So let's create a new component in our code. Here we're going to, well, let's create first the method in our account controller method. I'm going to copy the simplest one, which is this one. And we are going to call it create account in user mode. Okay? So here what we are going to do is that instead of just doing insert account, we are going to do insert as user account. I'm seeing here some errors because this is a beta and the tooling, the VS Code extensions and so on is not updated yet to support this kind of syntax. And it's telling me unexpected token, but it works, okay? If I deploy this to the org, it's going to work because the beta is already activated from the summer release. So my controller deployed correctly. Now we are going to create another Lightning Web component. I'm going to copy one, for instance, create no checks. I'm going to copy this one. We are going to call it create user mode. And we're going to modify the name of the files again. Let's tweak the HTML a little bit. User mode beta check. And we're going to modify the JavaScript also to use our new method. So the name of the method was create account user mode, I believe. Let me double check. Yes, create account user mode. Okay. So here what we are doing is to import that Apex method and call the Apex method here. So I'm going to deploy the component to the org. Sorry for my cough today. This time I'm going to edit the page in App Builder. Not with this user, of course. It's this page here. So here I should have a component called create user mode. Perfect. And now let me take a look at how the permission set was set up. So I have permissions to create, but sorry, that's my cat feeder. Okay, I have two cats and this is a cat feeder that calls my cat to eat. So yeah, so we have create permissions for the object, but we don't have create permissions for the annual revenue field or the industry field. So what should happen is that the creation of that account should fail because this user doesn't have permission, and we are doing the insertion in user mode. So let's try this out, and exactly, operation failed due to fields being inaccessible on S object. Amazing. So we have seen how it's very easy to use this new pilot in your code. Easy peasy, the code is super clean. You just add insert as or with user mode in your queries, and then you will have with that both object, field, and record level security enforced. To finish, I want to talk a little bit about sharing, about how to enforce record sharing. For that, I'm going to go back to the presentation again. So you're probably familiar with this, okay? To enforce sharing in SOQL and DML operations, what you do is to add a sharing keyword to the class in which you are performing those operations. And if you add a keyword saying with sharing, then that means that the record level security is going to be enforced. This is, if your user has permission to see specific records, then he or she is going to be able to see them. But if the user doesn't have permissions, then they are not going to be returned by the Apex class, or the user is not going to be able to perform a DML operation over those records in the Apex class. And then there is something else, an alternative that we can use to do the contrary, which is explicitly express that you want a class without sharing. As I told you at the beginning, sometimes this is a business requirement. Sometimes we just need our Apex code to run without sharing. But specifying the without sharing keyword in the class makes your developers at least understand and share with the other developers that take a look at the same code that they are doing that for a purpose. What I mean is, if you go through the security review, right, and you have some classes that are without sharing, and you have a comment that explains why that class is without sharing, and it has a very good reason for being without sharing, then the security review team is going to accept that that class is without sharing, because sometimes it's just a business requirement of our code, okay? But it's much better to use without sharing and with sharing explicitly than to not use anything. So to not use anything has some side effects, okay? Using no sharing clause behaves differently depending on the entry point on of your application, and it's considered a bad practice. Indeed, the product manager told me that in the future they were thinking even of not allowing to not specifying a sharing clause in a class. I don't know what's going to happen now that we have the user mode database operation, but that was something that the product manager told me a year ago, okay? We have an intermediate option, which is called inherited sharing. And when you have inherited sharing in a class, it means that the sharing enforcement, the sharing rules enforcement, is going to be inherited from the caller class. So for instance, let's say that you have an Apex controller. That controller is with sharing. And from that Apex controller, you are calling another class, which is a selector to make queries on the database. And in that class, you are specifying inherited sharing. That means that when you call that class through the Apex controller, the operations in that class are going to be executed with sharing. However, if you have another Apex controller or an API class or something that is without sharing, and you are calling your inherited sharing selector from that one, then that inherited sharing selector queries will be executed without sharing. They created this method, this sharing clause, to give you flexibility and to let you build a more advanced sharing model in your Apex classes hierarchy. Okay, so if we go to our app, there is another tab in which we are seeing the sharing examples. Again, here I'm logged with the system administrator, so I'm able to see everything. But if we go to the sharing settings of my organization, we can see that for account, which is the object that I'm using all the time, I have a private sharing model. That means that only the owner of the account, the person that creates the account, who is the owner, or the persons that are up in the role hierarchy, are going to have permission to read that account, to edit that account, etc., etc., etc. So if I take a look at those examples with the user that has less permissions, okay, in this case, the profile and permission sets are not really involved, okay? It's only the sharing rules. But what happened is that all these accounts, I created them with the system administrator. So in this Lightning Web component, I call in a class, an Apex class that is without sharing. And that means that this user is able to see these records even though they don't have access, read access to them, because the account object has a private sharing model in this organization. However, if I'm using a class that is with sharing, then I'm only able to see the accounts that I have created. I'm the owner. And if I use inherited sharing too, I'm going to show you the code for this. So this class is the class with sharing, is the one that we are calling in this component here. It enforces security. Let me close the other classes. Then we have this class called inherited sharing, in which we are using the clause inherited sharing. So what happens is that inherited sharing, this is the entry point in this case of Apex, and inherited sharing, when it is the entry point, okay, is with sharing. So that's the reason I'm only being able to see these accounts here. Has a behavior that is with sharing by default if the class itself is the entry point. And for the no sharing class, I have a class here in which I'm not using any sharing keyword. So this is a bit tricky, because if you call this no sharing class from Visualforce, then by default it's going to be without sharing or through an API. But if you call it from Lightning, from a Lightning Web component or an Aura component, then it's going to be with sharing. That's why I told you it's a bad practice to not use sharing clause, because it behaves differently if you are in a Visualforce page, if you are in a Lightning Web component, okay? And it may end up into errors in your security model. The most important thing to remember of this talk, enforcing sharing with sharing doesn't mean that you are enforcing object level security or field level security. The question that was made at the beginning and that most of developers don't know. Okay, so very important. With sharing doesn't enforce object or field level security. You will have to use these other methods that we saw today. Okay, so we have another more question on the chat. Okay. Is it safe to use this beta method going forward or can be rolled back by Salesforce? Okay, so when something is beta, Salesforce always tells you to not use it in production. I don't think that this concrete beta is going to be rolled back because it's something that is being developed for many months, even years, I believe, that is fully tested and that is very much needed and that is going to help developers a lot. So I don't think it's going to be rolled back, but it's true that beta programs always have that small I don't know how to say in English, but that caveat, right, that you need to remember or to bear in mind when using them. Then there is another question, but the user has object and field access. The thing is that profiles for sites is a bit different from other profiles, but I will try to permission set. Possibly it could help. Yeah, so what I told you is try it out, and if you have problems, just go to the Trailblazer community and ask your question there, because we monitor that chatter group too. And there is another question from Kamal. Alba, there is a way we can have the code for each component, like hosted somewhere? Yeah, of course. I was going to share that, okay? Thank you for reminding me. Is this repo here, okay? Is github.com. Oh, how can I zoom here? No, I cannot zoom, but it's github.com/albarribas/security. I'm going to paste it into the chat window. Not sure if you will be able to see the comment because sometimes YouTube doesn't let me post links, but I will make sure to add the link to the description of the video. Okay, this is the code for the app that I just showed, and you have the instructions to deploy it and to navigate the code. Okay, so to finish, I wanted to tell you that in Lightning Web Components, everything is enforced, okay? If you're using record form components to read data, they enforce object, record, and field level security. If you are using the Lightning Data Service, wire adapters, and functions, everything is enforced. You don't have to worry. And if you are calling Apex from your Lightning Web Components, then you have to enforce data security in Apex. Okay? Here you have some recommended resources. I will paste all these into the description of the video. The first one is a Trailhead module about security, about data security. I think it's a trail. Then this is the GitHub repo. We have also Apex recipes. There you have a couple more recipes that highlight security, and also the security guide for Salesforce and the security guide for Apex. Finally, I wanted to tell you that we are publishing content very often in the developer blog, which is at developer.salesforce.com. We share everything on Twitter. You can follow us in Salesforce Devs, and you can also follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, where you currently are. And finally, I wanted to show a slide which points to the chatter group that I told you in the Trailblazer community. If you have questions, make sure to go there and ask your question, because we are using that chat and monitoring it, not only us, but also the product managers. And that's it for today. Guys, I'm going to take a look at the hour. So I'm at the top of the hour. If you have questions, I can stay for a few more minutes if you want, but I'm not seeing anything in the chat so far. But I'm going to wait a little bit just in case. If not, you can always reach out to me again on Twitter. I'm on Twitter Alba SFDC, and my email is aribas@salesforce.com, and I always respond. Sometimes it takes me some time, but I almost always respond in time. Some people is saying thank you, thanks to you, of course, for attending the session and for giving me feedback and comments. I'm happy to see your comments. Thank you, Brolin. Thank you, Kamal, Andrew. There is a question. From Andrew. One question is user mode and open beta, or does it require enrollment? It's open beta. It's available in your org. You can use the methods I showed today right away in your org. And thanks from Ratindra too. Thanks to you. And if you don't have more questions, I will be closing by today. So stay tuned to the YouTube channel, because we are doing streaming every week at this same time. And I hope to see you in the next streaming or the next video. Bye bye. Have a good day.